to endure another 10 years of depression. Some people just look for warmth wherever they could. Outside cities. Farmers, poor farmers, especially tenant farmers, were often evicted from their lands. And here you see a black family who's trying to move on with the next phase of their unfortunate lives. Violence increased as the country looked for scapegoats. Many times it was Mexicans or Mexican Americans. There were many Americans of Mexican descent who were deported. Hundreds of thousands of them. They'd never been to Mexico. They were born in this country, but they were targeted as they're the ones responsible. Women were also singled out as having taken a job away from a man, and they should return. Actually, the number of women increased. The number of women working increased in the Depression, and it only aggravated the sense that women were somehow responsible for the adverse conditions. Violence increased against African Americans, who probably paid a deeper price than any other group. How many of you have heard of the Scottsboro case? Okay, well, they weren't lynched, of course, and that went up twice to the Supreme Court, and some fundamental guarantees about the conditions of a trial and the representation of a trial resulted from that case. If you don't know, the Scottsboro case was 9 so-called black boys who were riding the rails from Tennessee down to Alabama to a place called Scottsboro. And there were some fisticuffs and wrestling and that kind of thing, but a couple of young white women decided they would have some fun. And when they got off the train at Scottsboro, they pointed the finger at the 9 black men, young men, and said they gang raped us. It was provable that they did not, that nobody had, that they hadn't been raped at all. And a young doctor was asked by the court to investigate these women, to examine them physically, and the young doctor, white doctor, reported back to the court in the judge's chambers and said, no, nothing has happened here. There's no vaginal tearing, there's no motile semen. They were not raped. Simple as that. And there were other things I could tell you about. But in the final analysis, the judge said, you've got to testify about this. And the doctor said, I refuse, because if I do testify in open court, my medical career will be over. No white person will ever come to see me again. I could tell you about lynchings like the lynching of Claude Neal in the upper part of Florida, where he was forced to eat his own testicles before he was lynched, 1934. The breadbasket for the country took it on the chin as well. My family lived up in the Dakota area here and eventually moved down to Iowa. And my father remembers vividly what happened in the mid-1930s, and that was there was incredible soil erosion, drought conditions. But it isn't just that. The number one reason for the Dust Bowl is unwise farming. It happens regularly, but it was worsened at this time. You could literally suffocate in your home during the Dust Bowl. That's how bad it was. Lots of livestock lost their lives in these black blizzards. The middle of the country became a beach, as this drawing portrait shows you. And you can get some sense of the extent of the soil erosion. And lots of people simply gathered up their belongings and headed west, such as this desperate farmer. By the way, the Depression is quite well documented. We know a tremendous amount about it, and that was because the government hired writers and historians and social workers to go, and photographers, to go out and take pictures and get their stories. And that's one reason why we know a lot about slavery, for instance. We actually hired people to go interview people who were still alive from the slave days in the 1930s. And of course, you know about John Steinbeck's account of the Grapes of Wrath. They didn't find paradise out in California, these Okies and Texies and Arkies. In fact, life probably was at least as bad out there, but at least you weren't going to die of suffocation. And, relief to try to save these people began at the local level. That's the way it had always been. You rely on the Red Cross, the Salvation Army. The community, like Philadelphia, will pay you $5.50 a week. Remember the story I told you at the beginning? The woman in Pennsylvania with the 3 young children was getting $15.50 a week. Philadelphia, one of the most generous cities in America, was giving $5.50 a week. New York City was giving half that, about $2.25 a week. Others were giving 40 to 60 cents a week. But this is the way. So here you see the people gathered, and this woman, administrator, is going to decide whether they get the money or not. By the way, there were consequences for applying for relief. Nobody called it welfare or assistance. And one of the consequences was the debate went on, should you be barred from voting? Should your children be removed from the public schools? Should you be run out of town as a ne'er-do-well? And some of these things did in fact happen. These are government paintings that were done under the New Deal. Relief blues.
Do you know who the artist is?
I'm sorry, I don't. One way to cope with the Depression was to take jobs that you ordinarily wouldn't have done, such as selling fruit. Maybe an apple for a nickel, or you have a vegetable cart. That's a very inefficient way to make money, of course. This man said that he had lost everything in the stock market and would give his car for $100. This man offered to sell himself. There's only been one period in American history where people really volunteered for jury duty, and that was during the Depression. And giving blood. You didn't have to ask people to give blood. They signed up in droves. Of course, the charitable organizations and the cities and the towns had very little money, and most of it was gone in a year. So people began to look to the state government and to the national government for answers. While they waited, millions of Americans rode the rails. About 6 million people were hobos or vagabonds. 5 million adults and almost 1 million children rode the rails. And a lot of them jumped up on these tracks and were run over, the children especially. the Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd. And one of the interesting things about the Depression era is that bank robbers are made heroes, and gangsters as well. Since ordinary people couldn't make it at all in America. And here was the Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd that Woody Guthrie, one of the most important folk singers in American history, wrote. Yes, as though this world I ramble, I see lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun, some will rob you with a pen. But as through your life you'll travel, wherever you may roam, you will never see an outlaw drive a family from their home. So that was kind of the attitude that a lot of people had. Middle-class people listened to the radio. Radio listening went way up, and this is a map of radio frequencies. Or they went to see movies. People went to see movies almost as much as they did in the halcyon period of the 1920s. You know, there were 3 things that were depression-proof. Seeing the movies was one. Smoking a cigarette was another. And driving your car, the third. We'll see how that plays out in our own time. But you might see Shirley Temple was the #1 paid star in America in those days. Or James Cagney. Gangster movies were very, very popular until the motion picture industry rewrote the code. We can't have the bad guys come out ahead. You know, by the end they have to be shot, or they have to have lost their money, or some way they have to lose. Karl Marx preached a kind of chaos, anarchy. Groucho Marx. Freudian slip. Zeppo Marx, Harpo Marx. Superman was started in the 1930s. You need to be a super figure in order to make it, a fictional kind of figure. A lot of people followed the exploits of Joe Louis, particularly African Americans. That was one place where you could punch a white man and get away with it. Others turned to people like Father Divine in Harlem, who gave away free food. Some turned to socialism and communism. The membership of the Communist Party reached 100,000, the all-time high in American history. One reason that communism was popular in that time was it seemed that capitalism was having a nervous breakdown. Capitalism had failed. The new way was in Russia. And it was the communists who defended the Scottsboro Boys, who provided the attorneys. It was the communists who defended people who were evicted from their homes or apartments. It was the communists who preached absolute equality and seemed to mean it, whereas those ideas did not seem to be reflected in American society. Immigration was cut off enormously during the Depression years, really. The man that Americans turned to for answers was Herbert Hoover, and he seemed to be the perfect man for the job. If any man had risen from absolute obscurity, it was Herbert Hoover, who was born in this house in West Branch, Iowa. He was orphaned, and he became one of the greatest and wealthiest mining engineers the world knew. He was the great humanitarian. He had rescued people from the flood in Mississippi. He had helped the Belgians in World War I. His nickname was the great humanitarian, the great engineer. Calvin Coolidge called him the Wonder Boy, that he had all the answers. He was the first truly businessman president. So in any economic problem, he would have the answers. Well, I'm not here to demonize Herbert Hoover. In fact, historians have been rather busily rehabilitating his reputation, saying that he and FDR were a lot closer in their thinking than we've heretofore appreciated. But I will say this. Herbert Hoover, he needed a PR person. He needed someone to tell him what to do. He had never been in politics. He is a very successful Secretary of Commerce, the best one we ever had in the 1920s. He is great on relief. But he did not understand that everything he did in front of the people, every word he said would be watched and magnified. And basically, a lot of his plan was to encourage business to keep their workers. He would hold voluntary meetings at the White House and urge them on their own to keep their workers. That did not prove to be a very satisfactory approach. He would also issue public pronouncements, the most famous of which was, prosperity is just around the corner. But if you look at his statements, they came about one a month, like that one. So just have confidence. Hang on. Of course, they'd have to hang on for 11 years. That's a long time to hang on. He persisted in wearing his tuxedo when he sat down for dinner, and he had his valets serve him with cut glass and all of that, thinking that if he acted as if things were going to get better soon, they would get better soon. Of course, that was absolutely absurd. Hoover did some good things and some bad things. On the bad side, he ignored the advice of 1,000 economists who told him, do not sign the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the highest tariff in American history. It's hard to get two economists to agree. But 1,000 of them said, don't do it, and he did it anyway. Of course, what that meant is that the Depression would ripple throughout the world, and other countries would retaliate against American products. On the plus side, Hoover did speed up public construction projects. He doubled the number of construction projects that were being done. He signed the Federal Farm Board, which bought up hundreds of millions of dollars of farm surplus crops, hoping to create a scarcity, and other things too. He was not a do-nothing president, but there were limits to his activism. Perhaps the most far-reaching thing he did was to create a government agency called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned monies to banks and to corporations. But Wagg said that was the trickle-down theory. What trickle-down theory meant was that the banks, the donkey, the horse, would eat the hay, and it'd work its way through its system, and what was on the backside was what was left for the sparrows to pick and hope to survive. The death knell for the Hoover administration, of course, came in 1932 when thousands of World War I veterans descended on Washington demanding that they be paid their bonus. The bonus was not payable till 1945, in other words, at the end of World War II. And Hoover didn't like the demonstration outside the Congress, Anacostia Flats, and he ordered Douglas MacArthur to take care of it. 500 men, 5 tanks, they moved in, and it was a very ugly, ugly picture. And many people said, this is what Hoover really is. FDR said in the campaign, that's going to elect me. And of course it did. FDR was the first Democrat to win by a majority since 1852. Franklin Pierce, to give you some measure of the accomplishment. Now, why did FDR make a difference? It seems to me, if the policies of Hoover and FDR are closer than we previously thought, what is it that makes a difference, if indeed he made a difference? It seems to me several things. One, his attitude. People remarked on even the angle of the cigarette holder in which he smoked. It was up in the air. Most people, for a long time, I don't know, not a smoker, but most people smoking, it dangles out of the mouth toward the ground. But people remarked even on FDR's sunny attitude, even while smoking a cigarette. He smiled a lot. Hoover seldom smiled. He had a joke and a quip, and he seemed to be the life of the party, even though we know he was paralyzed. He was a paraplegic since his contraction of polio in the summer of 1921, after he had run for the vice presidency the previous year. So one reason he makes a difference is his attitude. He could connect with the common man even though he was born in this house and spent his whole life with Mama, Sarah Roosevelt. She died in 1940, so he had 5 years on his own, and Eleanor would not live there. She did not live in this house with her husband. She built another place down the road. And this sunny attitude was reflected not only in the words, so let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes our needed efforts. That was the kind of thing that Hoover had been saying, but FDR just said it so much better. He also relied on a brain trust, of which his wife Eleanor was part. Harry Hopkins, a social worker from Iowa and New York, professors from Columbia University like Rexford Guy Tugwell and Ray Moley, and many other people. Also, he had a black cabinet that included Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the head of a part of the New Deal, dealing with black Americans. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the eyes and the legs of her husband. And by the way, she knew that her secretary, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, was having an affair with her husband. And she thought, darn it, my husband is the best man in the country for this job. He reflects my ideals, and I'm going to stay married to him so that he can do the things that I truly believe in, even if we can no longer have a close relationship. Roosevelt also succeeded because he understood the value of symbolism, such as when opera singer Marian Anderson was given the land at in front of the Lincoln Memorial to perform when she was denied the opportunity to sing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. 75,000 people came to hear Marian Anderson. FDR wasn't the first president to speak on radio, but here's another reason why he could connect with the forgotten man. He didn't yell into the microphone. He seemed to caress the microphone. My friends, he would say, and people thought he was talking right to them in a way that no national figure had ever done. The fireside chats. Well, I've given you a handout. Let's turn to the handout. Once FDR took office, he promoted a domestic reform program called the New Deal. The New Deal was one of the longest periods of reform in American history, certainly politically it was. And it lasted from 1933 to 1938. We typically say the New Deal had two parts to it. The first 100 days, which lasted from March to June 1933, and the second part, which lasted from 1935 to 1938. Now, there were many acts. In fact, there were so many acts that sometimes the law was violated in order to ram through more legislation. One of the more famous episodes came when, I don't know if you know this, but you're supposed to read the law 3 times before you can vote on it. They didn't have the copy of the law, so they rolled up a newspaper and put it where the bill was supposed to be as if it was the law, and people were supposed to take it on faith That's how desperate people were to pass reform. Anything seemed better than nothing. Let me just kind of race through a few things that he did. He's the one who shut down the banks for 4 days and then established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure individual deposits up to $2,500. 75% of the banks were saved under that. 1 million homes were saved under another government alphabet agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The stock market had to be watched, and so we named that, Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, is the first chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, even though his own behavior had been a little questionable, to say the least. And FDR's response to that was, set a thief to catch a thief. That is, he'll know the bad things when he sees them. He also tried to save the farmers in a variety of ways. Here was one of the ways to convince people to destroy, the farmers to destroy the crops they had just planted, or the calves that had just been born, or the piglets that had just seen life. Why? Or I remember my social studies teacher talking about seeing the truckloads of oranges and grapefruit heading to the Gulf as people are hungry. And they raise the truck, the back of the truck to dump the grapefruit into the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico, in order to create scarcity, to improve prices, to raise prices. And then the government would pay farmers not to produce. Never been tried before. First time for farm subsidies, which we still have. Let's see, what else I've got. As he went about trying to save agriculture, so he tried to save industry. And here the answer was somewhat different. He trusted the industry to save itself, that is, various industrial fields. And 600 industries tried to regulate themselves through codes, industry-wide codes. How many workers should you have? What should the pay be? No child labor. How much should be produced? All of these things, each industry would decide for itself. It got to the point where even strippers, how many times could strippers strip in an evening before it crossed the industrial code? So this is what, but it didn't work very well. It didn't work well at all. There were attempts to create the Blue Eagle, to convince people to buy. How many of you would buy, if you had a Walmart right next to you, and down the road you had, let's say, Macy's, and you could buy the same article, but one thing would cost you much more, would you voluntarily go down the road to buy it? That's what the president was asking. As a matter of patriotism, pay more. A lot of people didn't want to pay more. There was a heavy emphasis on conservation. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which was clear and unalloyed socialism, there's no doubt about it. He hoped it was tremendously successful by any measure, TVA. It stopped the flooding. It produced cheap electricity. It promoted tourism, created jobs. It produced a lot of cheap fertilizer that the farmers needed. Tremendous success. People came from all over the world to see TVA. FDR wanted dozens of them. That was the only one, of course, because Congress couldn't abide the idea that it was government-built, government-owned, government-operated. The most popular work relief program was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Raymond Burr, Perry Mason was one of those who worked under the CCC. I'm told that Frank Sinatra was supposed to be one, but he never, no one knows why, I guess, why he never entered this. But they did a tremendous amount. They planted 2 billion trees. They tried to prevent another Dust Bowl. They created the modern park system. The Shenandoah Park is one such park. FDR won a tremendous victory in 1934. Usually parties in power lose in off-year races. Not that time. And then in 1936, he won another tremendous victory. There were detractors, people who didn't like all these agencies, people who thought like this cartoon. Mother Wilford wrote a bad word, and she's looking out to see what the bad word is, and it's that he wrote the word Roosevelt. He was often called a traitor to his class, that he had started the raw deal. Businessmen like the National Association of Manufacturers or Chamber of Commerce said that he was Stalin Delano Roosevelt. He was a fascist for trying to regulate capitalism. There were demagogues like Huey Long, who said every man a king, that no one wears a crown, share our wealth. He called for mandatory confiscation of every dollar anyone made more than $1 million. Anyone who's got $5 million, take it all. By the way, that would have paid 1% to 2% of all the things that Huey Long wanted to do. He said he used to say please, and then he found out dynamite worked a lot better, so he called himself the dynamiter, or the kingfish. The man in the middle, Dr. Townsend, proposed spending 50% of the nation's income to support 10% of the elderly. It just was totally unworkable. And then Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin, who had the greatest listening audience in the country, in Michigan, he had once praised the New Deal as Christ's deal. And then when FDR wouldn't pay him the kind of attention that he felt he deserved, he began to call it the Jew deal, that international bankers had taken over, the cartel had taken over the New Deal, and he urged a return to silver coinage, unlimited silver coinage, to solve the problems of deflation. The second New Deal consisted of some epic pieces of legislation. The most notable were the Works Progress Administration, which hired more than 10 million people. And I have some of the figures there under the WPA. 651,000 miles of roads were built, 125,000 public buildings, 8,000 parks. The elementary school I went to, the graduate library I used, the sidewalks in Texas I used to go down, where I first saw the Buffalo baseball team, War Memorial Stadium, and on and on. One of the reasons that FDR succeeded is that he understood that people needed a job. They needed the dignity of work. FDR was quite conservative in many ways. And one of the ways was he didn't want to just give people a check. Richard Nixon talked about a guaranteed negative income tax. That is, if you are alive, you should get money, if up to with certain limits. But FDR didn't believe that. And here's one of the key figures in the New Deal, Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet secretary. "6,000 artists, musicians, historians, storytellers, people were hired, professionals were hired. And some of the most interesting things, 60 million people heard a music performance, a symphony they'd never heard. 50 million people saw a play, a Shakespearean play that was maybe Macbeth with black performers, some twist on it. But it kept the arts alive, you see, an 11-year period. Jackson Pollock was one of the muralists for the Great Depression. Social Security, of course, was a building block. It's what created the modern welfare state. The first woman to get a check, the first person to get a check was Ida Fuller in 1940. She got about $35, I think it was. Today, more than $500 billion is paid out. Originally, it was about $25 million. But even the way Social Security is funded is conservative. Okay? It doesn't come out of tax revenues, directly from the government receipts. People and employers put the money in. And FDR said, I did it that way because once people start paying into Social Security, no politician can ever shut it down because people have got their money in it. Labor did tremendously well in the New Deal period. 30% of workers were unionized as a result of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the same thing. And John L. Lewis, the leading labor figure of that day, the head of the United Mine Workers, helped found what becomes the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Later on, it merges with its much more conservative counterpart, the AFL. And Lewis told the workers, the president wants you to join a union. Not quite that far, but the president did create the legislation that made modern unionization possible, in particular collective bargaining. Employers must negotiate with the freely chosen representatives of the workers. Roosevelt is also the one who pushed through the minimum wage, maximum hours, the end to child labor, and on it goes. I mean, it's really amazing. You see the growth of union membership shot through the roof. That brings me to the court. Another thing that Roosevelt did for the common man, for the forgotten man, was that he appointed 8 men who believed in the egalitarian principles that he said were a fundamental prerequisite to being appointed to the Supreme Court. And the old court is here. You see some progressive figures, most notably Louis Brandeis, but you also see the 4 horsemen, such as George Sutherland here, and Pierce Butler, and Willis Vandervanter. There were 4 horsemen of the apocalypse who would vote against progressive legislation such as the New Deal had. And if you turn to the backside, you'll see exactly what they were striking down. The National Labor Relations Act, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, conservation, and finally, FDR had had enough. He said, look, I've won a great landslide in 1936, one of the greatest elections in American history, almost 61%. I'm the representative of the people, the tribune. Not the courts, they're the reactionary ones. They're the 9 old men who were stuck in the horse and buggy days. The 9 scorpions in the bottle, the ones who were out of step. And so secretly he concocted this court packing plan to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, an extra one for every justice 70 years of age or older who would not retire. Why? Publicly, he said, because they're old, because they're inefficient. They can't keep up. That was a lie. Brandeis, who was the oldest, he was the most progressive. He was clearly efficient. The issue wasn't efficiency, the question was ideology. And the Supreme Court seemed to be on the verge of getting rid of Social Security, the minimum wage, and other key parts of the New Deal. And that he could not abide. Pardon? What year what? 1937. 1937. This is how it seemed. FDR wanted a yes man, and people were very, very upset with the court packing plan. By the way, nothing illegal about the court packing plan. Nothing illegal about it. Foolish? Yes. Unwise? Certainly. We've had as few as 5 Supreme Court justices, and we've had as many as 10. There's nothing sacrosanct about 9. But he was terribly unwise in trying to change the court with this plan that he devised in secret. Robert Jackson had been promised that he would become Chief Justice, but he was passed over. Why? Because FDR asked for the advice of Charles Evans Hughes, the Chief Justice at the time, and he got the advice from Felix Frankfurter, and he concluded that Robert Jackson needed seasoning. As he told his son, Jackson did not have enough experience, and that's what Hughes was saying too. Oh, wrong one. So Hughes, progressive governor of New York, was telling the president, Jackson's not ready. Let him wait. FDR appointed the most far-reaching most progressive court in American history. He elevated Harlan Fiske Stone to Chief Justice when Hughes stepped down, and then he named Hugo Black, who was a loyal New Deal senator from Alabama. It later came out that he had been a life member of the Ku Klux Klan. But a lot of people, even before that came out, some of his advisors, FDR's advisors, were like, is this the best we can do? Hugo Black from Birmingham? Of course, he goes on to become one of the greatest of all justices who revolutionized our understanding of the Constitution and church-state and a whole variety of things, the supremacy of the First Amendment and so on. He also named Stanley Reed, a gentleman's gentleman from Kentucky, Felix Frankfurter, who had trained so many of the advisors and staffers in the New Deal. Felix Frankfurter was an immigrant from Austria who came here when he came here, he didn't know a word of English. 11 years later, he was valedictorian of the Harvard Law School. I mean, he was an incredible legal talent. William Douglas. Oh, I want to tell you this one story. We're about out of time, but I do want to tell you a story about the way FDR was. He called up Felix Frankfurter, and he had all along been telling Frankfurter, I really want to appoint you. And he had told William Douglas this too. I really want to appoint you to the Supreme Court. But you know, there's a lot of balance questions and political questions. We don't have anybody from the far west. I really want to appoint you. So he calls up Frankfurter's home, and they're getting ready to go out for dinner. And Mrs. Frankfurter is telling Felix, get ready, get ready. He's in his underwear. And the president calls. And Roosevelt starts again on this kick. Felix, I want to appoint you to the court. Yeah, I've heard this before. Nothing would please me more than to appoint you to the court. And Mrs. Frankfurter is saying, he's just telling you the same old stuff. He's teasing you. And just about the time Frankfurter's about to hang up, Roosevelt said, I can appoint you to the Supreme Court, which he did. But Roosevelt enjoyed playing with people. he was quite manipulative in that way. Ultimately, of course, he appoints Robert Jackson, one of the most well-qualified people ever to be picked for the Supreme Court. I'm going to talk more about Jackson and some of his jurisprudence tomorrow. But Jackson had thought that he was going to be named to some other post in the administration. He wanted to go home. He was tired of Washington. But he becomes one of the great stylists that ever served on the court. In the words of Henry Abraham, one of the most perceptive critics of the appointments that presidents have made, one of the greatest. Not as great as Hugo Black, but certainly a near great justice. Let me close with the words of a mill worker in North Carolina who wrote to the White House as a result of all these things that we've been talking about. And by the way, the Roosevelt Court saves Social Security. It saves the minimum wage. It never again strikes down labor legislation of consequence. This mill worker from North Carolina said what millions of people believed. Mr. Roosevelt, you are the only man we ever had in the White House who understands that my boss is a son of a bitch. Thank you.
As we conclude, for those who are, we appreciate if you'd fill out, all of you have a little evaluation for today. Bruce will be back tomorrow to give a presentation as indicated. And for the attorneys, if you plan on attending other events here, great, hang on to it, because you can fill out your attendance and hand it in at the end of your time here. If it's just here for today, fill it out and hand it to Mary as you're leaving. Thank you very much, and we'll start all over again tomorrow morning. Thanks for coming.